In the early hours of Thursday 20th December 1877, tragedy struck at a hotel in Edinburgh. The evening before, at Milne's Commercial Hotel on 24 Greenside Street in the Greenside district of the city, fire had broken out in the upper attic story where the laundry was situated. The hotel had a frontage of 5 stories, but 7 stories at the back due to the ground it was built on. The 3 upper stories were used as a hotel, with the floor at street level being used for shops and businesses, while the basement levels were divided into houses of 1 and 2 apartments, all accessed by a common stair. The fire had been discovered by Milne's sister-in-law, who happened to be passing the door at the time, and although the fire brigade was summoned quickly, the fire spread rapidly and had burst through the roof before they arrived. A hand pump was used initially, but had little effect. The steam engine arrived at 6:30 p.m, but by that time the whole roof was one mass of flames. Using the hose attached to the mains water supply, they poured water on the blaze, and although it burst, it was repaired quickly. However, the floor caught fire from the falling burning debris from the roof. At around 8 o'clock, the fire was finally extinguished, although water was doused on the smouldering embers for a time after this, but the attic story, which also contained a sitting room and 2 bedrooms, was completely destroyed. Many of the rooms in the hotel and furniture were destroyed by the water from the hoses, but no one in the houses thought they were in any danger. On the Thursday morning, the upper floor gave way, falling through the 6 flats below, burying the families who lived in 3 of them among the debris. Although people in the hotel had been told of the danger, it seems those who occupied the houses were not. The top house that was destroyed belonged to William McClellan, a painter, who'd noticed the beams in his house bending and bowing at the southeast corner. He woke his wife and family and sent them to his father's house. He returned to inspect his home and to remove some of his belongings. By sheer luck, he happened to go into the house of his neighbour, William Gordon, also a painter, on the landing to warn him of the danger when the roof collapsed, but he escaped along with his neighbour. They had already managed to evacuate Gordon's disabled wife and were about to remove his bedridden father-in-law. The next house below McClellan's was home to widow Mary Clark or Topping, aged 42, who had a family of 6. Her eldest was around 18 or 19, with her youngest aged around 1. They were all in the house in bed at the time it collapsed. At around 3 o'clock, the bodies of Mary and her eldest daughter, also Mary, aged 18, and her little boy, Andrew, aged 12 months, were taken out of the building during the rescue and recovery operation and taken to the Central Police Office in the High Street. They had all been found lying together. The house on the bottom was home to Mrs. Anne Haig, a widow aged 62, and her sons, John, Willie and David, but at the time, David wasn't at home. However, Walter Purvis, a 33-year-old cabman, was visiting the Haigs at the time. Mrs. Agnes Stevens, whose house had been deluged in water when the fire brigade had been putting out the fire in her flat, and her daughter were staying with the Haigs that night too. The other tenants had managed to divert the water from their front doors, driving it down the stairwell, and it was while doing this a terrible crash was heard as the roof fell in. John Haig was rescued, but was unconscious, although comparatively uninjured. Robert Topping, a 16-year-old telegraph messenger and son of Mrs. Topping, also escaped with only slight injuries, but was nonetheless taken to the Royal Infirmary. 15-year-old Christina Stevens, a mill worker and daughter of Mrs. Stevens, was more seriously injured and also taken to the Royal Infirmary. However, she survived. She'd been saved by two beams wedged a couple of feet above her, but she did sustain a head injury. Harriet Topping, the younger daughter of Mrs. Topping, was also hurt and looked after by a neighbour initially, before being taken to hospital. 5-year-old John Topping, who was thought to be missing, was discovered at his uncle Andrew Topping's house in Grange Road. The man who discovered him in the ruins had carried him to Moy's Temperance Hotel at 17 Greenside Street, where Mrs. Moyes had taken care of him. His uncle had heard what had happened and went to collect him, much to the disappointment of Mrs. Moyes, who had initially hoped to adopt him. Topping failed to report he'd taken the boy to police, and 4 hours of searching the dangerous ruins by firemen had been a complete waste of their time. As soon as the incident happened, news of the fire was sent to several fire stations, and on arrival, assisted by several volunteers, they began to clear away the debris, as they knew several people were trapped beneath it. The work was difficult, arduous and dangerous. By daybreak, enough progress had been made that they could hear the groans of a man. It was Purvis, the cabman. As the rescuers dug for him, they found he was trapped, with a large piece of hearthstone resting on his chest. He told his rescuers to be quick, as the stones are squeezing me heavier and heavier. He managed to speak with the firemen, and a hole was made in the debris so he could be given some water. Mr. Barty, the assistant to the borough engineer, crept in beside him and held his head and shoulders while the 20 feet or so of debris was removed from round him. Extricating him was no easy feat, due to the danger of broken joists and other debris still falling down, but after taking their time, he was finally freed around 1 o'clock. He'd been entombed for 12 hours. He was taken to hospital, where it was discovered he'd broken an arm and a leg. Purvis died at 5 o'clock that afternoon. Shortly after this, the body of Mrs. Haig was removed, as she'd been found next to Purvis. It appeared she'd been dead for quite some time. During the afternoon, as the debris was cleared, further bodies were found. These were Mrs. Stevens, aged 50, and her son, John, a railway worker, aged 20. Her other son, Willie, heard the crash as the ceiling caved in and made a run for the door and escaped. On Friday, 21st December, workmen got to work dismantling the interior of the hotel. The cause of the fire was believed to have been some clothes hanging on a clothes horse in the laundry that had fallen over onto the grate and subsequently caught fire. The damage was estimated at around £3,000, and although Milne was insured, many of the householders were not. Greenside Street no longer exists, but it once extended from Nottingham Place to Greenside Place off Leith Street. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.